afternoon to be able to present Dr. Kennedy, professor of and to celebrate his 2017 book, Bricklayer Bill, The Untold Story of the Workingman's Boston Marathon. A graduate of Boston College, where he earned his bachelor's degree in political science, his master's in history, and his doctorate in American history, Dr. Kennedy has focused many of his books and articles on Boston, the city where he first studied. Thus, his first book, a choice, outstanding academic book, is Planting the City Upon a Hill, Boston since 1630. Since then, he has published with Walter Muir Whitehill, Boston, a Topographical History, now in its third edition. And now, Bricklayer Bill. His work, widely published in journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedia articles, and book reviews, explores Boston politics in the 19th century. And he has presented papers at the American Historical Association, the New England Historical Association, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Museum, and the National Famine Museum of Ireland. He is currently working on two books. One on the career of Patrick A. Collins, an Irish-American nationalist leader and politician. I take it, Bill, Larry, he's from Boston. And one, Pounding the Pavement in Port Chester, another book on long-distance runners, this time addressing the runners and their local boosters in Westchester County, New York, during the Great Depression. Well, I am just delighted with this book. I don't know if you've begun reading it, but I want to tell you that Bricklayer Bill is a wonderful book, not least because it took Bricklayer Bill's descendants to bring his story to life. Dr. Kennedy is Bricklayer Bill's grandnephew, and he co-authored Bill's story with his son, Patrick. And the story they tell is enthralling. I began reading it last week, and I just couldn't put it down. This account of an Irish-American working man who loved to run, who won the Boston Marathon in 1917, just over 100 years ago, at age 33, and returned to his job site the next day, lay bricks, who kept running at least until the middle years of World War II, so won the Boston Marathon during World War I, kept running World War II, is a compelling story of long-distance runners in the context of the sport and commercialized. Please join me in welcoming Bricklayer Bill's grandnephew and chronicler of Bill's running life, Dr. Larry Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and I'd like to thank Sandra Myers, who runs the Schemmel Forum and who does so much to enrich the university and the Scranton community and really, I think, the world, for inviting me to present here tonight and to talk about this book. And I want to thank Allison Morrison, who's done so much to take care of the details of this program and every other program. So I'd also like to thank you for coming this evening. A beautiful day here in Scranton, and to come in out of the sunshine is delightful. I appreciate that. I'd like to thank the people in the Weinberg Library as well, and Dean Charles Kratz and the Friends of the Weinberg Library who are co-sponsoring this or collaborating with the Schemmel Forum. And I notice in the audience we have people from the library, and I appreciate all the good work they've done over the years, and couldn't go without mentioning Betsy. I did see Betsy Moylan here before, who's, as the head of reference, helped me a good bit doing the work earlier. the cover of the book actually has a photograph that we got. It was in a family, but it was kind of water drops and kind of a mess. And it was people here in the library did the work with the digital librarians and some work study students that actually cleaned it up and was allowed us to use it as a cover without having all the spots. So it's a photograph that's 101 years old now. And so again, the library here has done a great deal to help my work on this and other projects. I want to thank, I won't keep going with the thank yous too many more, but just to say what a thrill it was to work on a family study. Bricklayer Bill was my grandfather's brother, working on this with my son and with my wife, Judy, who is here in the third row over here, getting a little bit embarrassed. But it's been, the whole project was just tremendously exciting, and okay, there were a few negative points, but but it was exciting, even if it was negative, I guess. So let me tell you about the book and Bricklayer Bill. When I was growing up in the 1960s, people would ask with the name Kennedy, "Are you related to, you know, those Massachusetts Kennedys?" And a lot of times I would say, "No, I'm not," or, you know, "Wish I had their money," or something like that. But we grew to understand that we could always say, well, we're not related to those Kennedys, but my Uncle Bill won the Boston Marathon. And people would go, "Oh, that's pretty good." You know, still not president of the United States, but it was all right. I didn't really know much about Bill. I knew he had won the marathon. He lived in St. Louis, and he had a daughter named Juanita. And to, you know, an Irish-American guy growing up in Connecticut in the 1960s, Juanita was kind of inexplicable, exotic. It was like, where did that name come from? And never found out where they got the name. But Bill was distant. I never met him because he was in St. Louis, and he did, though, contribute to a certain sense of pride that we had in the Kennedy family, in our branch of the Kennedy family. And it was later that I found out so much about Bill and what an amazing person he was. And I found out that, in fact, he was someone who was a real character. And a lot of times when we call someone a character in my family, it meant they were a big drinker. And Bill qualifies on several levels. I also found out many years later that he had written a manuscript of his experiences back in the teens, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I never realized this until it was about 7 or 8 years ago. And my older son, Patrick, and I, when we found out about this, decided to pursue it and see what we could do. So over here we have Patrick there, and Uncle Bill with his dates, 1883 to 1968. So Patrick and I were out to dinner with Judy and Patrick's wife, Andrea, and our other son, Paul, and his wife, Kate, with a cousin, an elderly cousin. And I say elderly, and that's anything 10 years ahead of me or 20 years ahead of me. And she was my father's generation. And this was a cousin that Bill had corresponded with in the early 1960s. And she was an editor at Harvard University Press, and he's in Chicago, in St. Louis at that point. And he had been writing his experiences up. And he thought, well, she should be able to help him out. And so she sent, or he would send copies of a chapter to her. And originally it was handwritten, and so she said, well, first of all, you have to type this thing up. So he typed it up, and it's full of all sorts of mistakes. And, you know, I type with 2 fingers, and I think Bill typed with 1, or I don't know, but a lot of original copy of this manuscript is a little difficult to read, even though it's typed up, and he scrawled in more information. But the point is, he wrote this manuscript and sent it to her. She tried to fix it up a little bit and sort of, you know, worked on the grammar and the prose and try to improve it. And plenty of seats right up front. Welcome, John and Joyce. Nice to see you. So he wrote this up, sent it to her, and it went back and forth a little bit. And then sadly, he had a stroke, and nothing happened with the manuscript. And she left it actually in a box. And she moved from Cambridge out to the next town, Watertown, and she put it in her basement. And it was there from somewhere, I think they moved in the mid-'70s, until we were out with Anne Louise, my cousin, having dinner, and she was a great source of the family stories, and she would talk about everybody, and if there could be a good version or a bad version, she'd always give the bad version, you know, and so she was a lot of fun, and you know, we get all sorts of dirt, and much of it was probably true. But she could be a little bit unreliable. But at any rate, we had dinner, and she mentioned just rather casually that she had this manuscript from Uncle Bill, and you know, we just like, what? You know, you have this manuscript? And she said, oh yeah, I know. So we all were pretty interested in this and expressed some interest, and she said, oh well, you know, I'll get it for you sometime. A little skeptical that I was ever going to see the manuscript, because she had been promising to give the family Bible from her great-grandparents for years, 15, 20 years. She was saying, I'm going to give it to you. You're the next generation. You're the one that's interested in history. You should get this thing. And her husband would say, well, I'll go get it right now, Anne Louise. And she'd say, well, no, not quite. So I wasn't really sure she was going to turn this thing over. But at any rate, she does turn the manuscript over to Patrick and his wife, Andrea. They lived in Brighton, they still live there, not too far away from her place. And so they you know, would go and visit her more often, and so gradually she became accustomed to the notion of letting go of something. And she had a beautiful home which was full of all sorts of things, including dresses that her mother and her aunts had from the 30s and the 40s, and brochures and books that she had read, and travels around the world. She was a brilliant woman who collected and held on to everything. So at any rate, she had this manuscript. She gave it to us, and Patrick took the manuscript, typed it up, and thought, well, we could do something with this manuscript. It's something like 36,000 words. It had 26 chapters in it, one for each mile of the marathon. And it had titles like diet, transportation, prizes, coaches, and you know, that type of thing. So it was, in some ways, it was a very personal account about things. In other ways, it was a book which was more like an encyclopedia. He wanted very, very much here in the late 50s, early 60s to get the story out, because there really wasn't much. There was no book about American marathons at that time. There would be a few, like Clarence DeMar was a great winner in Boston, had written his story back in the 1930s, but there were no studies really of marathoning. And so Bill, who had no education beyond you know, the age of 12 or 13, wrote this account, and he would list who won and all sorts of things. Unfortunately for us, he didn't write enough about himself. He wanted to make it about the other runners and about the sport. And so he was a man who considered himself a chronicler of what marathoning was all about. And so he wrote this story, we got it, and we thought, well, we'll put it together and take his writing and, you know, put some pictures and so on. We started looking into newspapers, and we discovered just treasures that in the 1920s, the teens, into the 30s, there were loads of stories about Bill and all these other marathoners who were working men like Bill. They were plumbers and carpenters and printers, and we were just overwhelmed with the material. We were just thrilled, and but we printed out so much. You know, we would look at a microfilm. Anybody here know what microfilm is? I asked my students, and you know, what are you talking about? But at any rate, so we decided we were going to do a book about this, and we had to do a little investigation, kind of put the setting in, the family history. So we started the story in Ireland, but I just want to mention here that my part of the story, my thinking about Bill in a kind of an organized way, really began in the 1970s. And this is on the route of the marathon. And some people here who've run, I know we've had a few runners. So are there any other runners here, people who run the marathon? Over here, Vince, okay. He's run Boston 4 times, I believe. Let's give him a hand. I mean, it's impressive, really is. And maybe we'll be doing another one before too long. Great. So I was a student at Boston College in the early 70s, and this is a scene from much, much later, as you can tell. But back in those days, I would go to the library as an undergraduate student and be able to do some work in the library, do some studying on the day of the marathon. And you know, they would start then at noontime, and so it would be just before 2 o'clock. I'd think, well, you know, I've had enough work. I'll go out maybe a quarter or 20 of, and look, see what's going on. There was no huge crowd out there at that time. Things started changing with Bill Rogers, who was also a student at Boston College. He was a graduate student then in the 70s, and the crowd started coming, the hometown fellow and the hometown hero. I was in the library one day in 1978. By that time I was in a graduate program and I was working on European diplomatic history. Yes, Sean, I did work on European history, my colleague over here. And I was writing a paper about Lord Castlereagh, who was the British Prime Minister, or Foreign Minister at the Congress of Vienna. And it was pretty interesting, but it was kind of heavy going. And I thought, you know, I'm here in a microfilm collection. Why don't I go take a look at the papers? Because I'd always wondered about Bill. I never knew anything about him. So, you know, so I looked in the microfilm, went to the Boston Globe, looked for April 20th, 1917, and there's the image that I got. And back in those days, the microfilm, of course, it was the negative image. And again, well, you're all too young to remember this stuff, but I'm looking at it in reverse, and it was like, wow, it looked like my father. I was like, I couldn't believe it. And so Kennedy runs a marathon, so I read about him. This is great. Printed it out, put it in a file, you know, went home. We had Patrick, who was almost 2 at that point. You know, I was teaching, I was going to school. It got left in a folder for years and years and years. So nothing much happens until this dinner in, I think it was 2010, is that right? That we found out about this manuscript. So we found out about the manuscript of Bill. I had in the back of my mind, well, I could look in the Boston Globe. But we thought, well, look into some family history. So very, very quickly, Bricklayer Bill comes from a long line of, or I come from a long line of builders. The Kennedys, our family, the Kennedys, came from Cashel area in County Tipperary. So I'm not here to tell you that we built this castle. I haven't documented that yet. I'm trying to get a research grant to go back and check it out. I'll keep you posted. Check my blog once I actually get a blog. But my great-grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, came to this country in the 1850s. He left Ireland at the time of the famine. He went to Manchester, England, learned about not only stone, he was a stonemason, but also in Manchester learned about bricklaying and working with brick. Came to the United States in the 1850s and married a woman named Margaret Kennedy. So if we are connected to the other Kennedys, it's arguably through Margaret Kennedy, who we're not sure from. But anyway, we have a long line. My great-great-grandfather, Joseph, was a partner in this firm who built churches in New England, including St. John's Church in Stamford, Connecticut. The day before my grandfather passed away in 1967, we were driving down the Connecticut Thruway and going to a reunion of his World War I veterans, the men in the Connecticut National Guard who had gone to France. And I remember him pointing out as we drove by, you know, that's the building that, you know, he said my grandfather built in the 1860s. And his son, Joseph's son, Lawrence, was a young fellow who worked on that structure in the 1860s. And later he was the father of Lawrence, was the father of Bill, and my grandfather Paul. This is Lawrence, the original, we call him LJ to try to keep it clear, but this is Bill's parents, and Lawrence was, again, the son of immigrants. He married Louisa O'Brien, who was an immigrant herself, so she was from Ireland. She and her family had a boarding house, a rooming house in Portchester, New York. I have to say that slowly. We always say Portchester, like it's one word, but it's two words, Portchester. So they married in the early 1880s, and Bill was one of the eldest in the family. LJ went and worked on the Biltmore Estate in the 1890s, so continued working with stone, but also working with brick. In 1883, he has a son, Bill, who is shown here on the left, and there's my grandfather, Paul Kennedy Sr., on the right, and obviously in the World War I uniform. So there's where it is finding out about my uncle, Bill. Now, the one thing I did find out fairly early on, going back really into the 1970s, was the story that Bill slept on a pool table and that he had hitched up to Boston. So, anybody know who Jock Semple was? Maybe Vince recognize that the organizer. He was kind of referred to as Mr. Marathon back in the 60s and 70s in Boston. He ran with my great uncle there back in 30s and 40s. Jock was the one who very, very famously, if you were to look up about women running the Boston Marathon, and Jock is the one who ran out and tackled tried to tackle Kathy Switzer in 1967, I think that was, because women weren't allowed to be in the marathon. And later, you can find other photos where he and Kathy are pals and everything worked out fine. But anyway, Jock Semple, I hope I haven't discredited him entirely. But he was, in his book, he talked about Bricklayer Bill, and he says it was Kennedy who was typical of the manual worker who found himself unemployed, and he was running to kill the dead time while waiting for a job that rarely came. Bricklayer Bill, as they called him, was famous for wearing a red, white, and blue kerchief on his head in the Boston Marathon. Bill enjoyed, and this is the legend, Bill enjoyed his one shining moment in 1917 when he hitchhiked to Boston from New York and slept on a pool table in the south end of Boston. The next day he won a race, the moment of glory Bill spent the rest of his life trying to recapture. So, pretty great legend, and most of the books about the Boston Marathon would tell that story, that he hitchhiked from New York and he slept in a pool table. Sometime under the pool table, but he slept in wasn't really the case, but we found that what we think, what did actually happen in many ways was really more interesting. So we'll get to that a little bit later. So the marathon. As you probably know, the modern marathon begins in 1896 with the revival, the tradition, the notion of the Olympics. So they hold the marathon in going to Athens. It was something like 25 miles at that time. So this was a great international festival, and it was a big success. People came from the United States and from other countries to go there. Well, some New Yorkers decide we should have a race like that here in New York. So they set up a race from Stamford, Connecticut. You remember that's where St. John's Church was, down along to New York. And so we've got, courtesy of Google or whatever it is, Stamford going through Portchester, which we'll see a little bit more about, and down into the Bronx. And so we've got the first marathon in this country is a marathon in New York. So you hear about the Boston Marathon, the oldest marathon, oldest continuously run marathon. It's been running every year since 1897, because the Boston Marathon was a little bit behind New York. That happens once in a while. How are the Yankees doing this year? Anyway, sorry. So it's in this race in 1896 that Bill is a youngster in Portchester. He and the guys are hanging out watching these runners come by. Bill decides, along with a few of his friends, to jump in and run. So they run through Portchester. They get to the town line, and that's about it. And he later wrote about he participated in the first marathon in America, which was true. Not official, but he did run. So a few years later, 1898, his mother died. His mother gave birth to 9 children, died in her early 40s. I've looked at the death certificate, and the doctor wrote, please, no laughs. I mean, exhaustion. And the woman had given, she had anemia and exhaustion. And later when I tell you about Bill falling off a building and hitting and killing somebody, I guarantee somebody's going to laugh, but hopefully not. But anyway, back in 1898, his mother died. Bill and his brother Joe, who was very close to him in age, decided after not too much time to leave town. Now, my grandfather was born in 1892, and he had 2 younger sisters. So these 3 were the young ones. They were put in essentially an orphanage. LJ, my grandfather, really wasn't able to handle the family too well, or he was a successful businessman at this point, but his fathering left apparently something to be desired. Bill and Joe, very much according to the family lore, very much like him, butted heads quite a bit, and they decided to leave. So I have to point out, this isn't actually a photograph that we have, somebody in the family took, but I was looking, trying to get some of these pictures, and like, well, there's a couple of kids going on a train. So they left, and they went around the turn of the century, just headed west. And so they're like 17, 15 years old, and they were gone. And Bill was basically on the road for the rest of his life. He does settle down for times, and he had a wife and family, but he was perpetual motion, and he would be bricklaying and running at night. He would go for jobs. He'd travel all around the U.S. looking for jobs. He always described it as going on a side door Pullman. So he was like many, many other workers on the road, not going to pay for it. They just would get on the freight car, a real Pullman car, as you know, the beautiful cars, but the sidecar Pullman. And what he did was travel around. He ended up in St. Louis in the early years. St. Louis, one of the great, it still is a great brick city. They had a great fire, built many brick buildings afterwards. There are many brick manufacturing plants there. So it was a very great place. It also had a brewing company there, which he found sympathetic. They were all over the country, so it wasn't particularly there. They also had a World's Fair in St. Louis. Meet me in St. Louis, what's her name? Judy Garland, right? Wasn't she in that? Okay. Bill actually was back east for a little bit, and he said he was at a ball game and he heard this, something about this and maybe the song, I don't know, but he thought, I'm going to go out to St. Louis, and he upped and went. And so he went back to St. Louis. So anyway, he's out in St. Louis. And he's there at the time of this fair, and in the midst of the fair they had the Olympics, and it was 1904 in St. Louis in the United States, and in those Olympics, Bill seemed to find his avocation. He didn't join in, he wasn't on the Olympic team. We have a Native American runner. There were many famous Native American runners in the early 1900s. And this is also the era of Jim Thorpe and so on. So it's a great, great American epic and international marathon. So Bill was pretty excited about it. People in St. Louis were excited about it. And within a few years, they decided they were going to have their own marathon. And it's described as the St. Louis Marathon or the Missouri Athletic Club All-Western Marathon. So they would run a 25-mile race, or they'd run a modified marathon, might be 11 miles. They ran 6-mile races, all sorts of races. And Bill got into it. Earlier in his years in New York, he had been a boxer and an amateur boxer, and got paid a little bit, was illegally boxing but at some of the clubs at Coney Island and other places, pick up a few bucks. But it was pretty damaging, and he realized this really wasn't the way to go. But he started running, training for boxing. And so he got into running somewhere around maybe 1906, 1907 in St. Louis. But he continued to work as a working as a bricklayer since the age of 13. Again, I've just pulled some images from the web to try to illustrate something of what was going on at the time. But what he did throughout those years was ride the rails or ride the rod. So, getting in these, and this is, I think, again, a later image, but showing riding on the rods, and that's the way they moved around, again, by the thousands. One of the places he went to was Des Moines, Iowa, and in 1908, he's working on this building here, the Coliseum, and he was in October 20th, I think it was, he was on this structure, actually it was in 1909 when he was there, leaning over the edge, wiping some of the mortar off, and the winds had picked up, and he fell or was blown off the about the fifth story, down some 65 feet to the ground. He landed very tragically on, I'd say I warned you so nobody's going to laugh, that's good. But I've mentioned other times people just snickered, like he landed, killed somebody, and they thought it was humorous, but it wasn't. And so he does survive through the death of this poor fellow, John Holmquist. We did a little more investigation, found out that Holmquist did have some insurance provided by the company, but he left a wife and I think it was 5 children, and he was a young fellow in his 40s. Bill broke his leg. He wrote about it, that people thought he was dead. They thought he was killed. He wasn't, obviously, but he did have a broken leg. He was able to get back up and running within a matter of months, and so he carried on from there. But it was something that it seemed to bother him a bit, as he wrote about it later, and he didn't want to talk about it too much or write about it very much. He's running some marathons in the Midwest in those years, in 1910, 1911 or so, and then he goes to Boston for his first marathon in 1912, and we don't really know which one is Bill there, but it's not a big crowd. The Boston Marathon, again, has been running since 1897. Sometimes it would be 50, sometimes 60, fewer. It wasn't huge crowds running in those days. He returns to St. Louis, and I've skipped over an important part of the story. He met and got married to a young woman, a very young woman, named Jessie Herbert. He was living in a boarding house in St. Louis as a widow with Lizzie Herbert. She had 3 daughters. He fell in love with the first, Nellie, and got engaged to her, but he was off on the road. And I think that's when he went out to Des Moines in 1909. So he comes back. Nellie had gotten married. Nellie moved out of the house, and Bill was pretty upset about that. So as the story turns out, within the next year, he married pretty quickly, and under some pressure apparently, the second daughter, and that's Jessie. And so he married Jessie, and they remained married to her till the day he died in 1968. But he was on the road, and we don't know whether he was on the road because that's just his nature, or because he wanted to keep away from Jessie, or Jessie, whatever. They didn't have the greatest, happiest relationship, but not blaming anything on Jessie. Bill was just the way that he was. But he's winning some marathons, and 1913 was just a great year for him. And Bill won this all-Western marathon in St. Louis, April 19th, 1913. This is the day that the Boston Marathon was run. So he would have been in Boston for his second run, but they ran this marathon. He wanted to stay with his hometown club. So he runs this in April, and actually wins it with a very slow time. It was over 3 hours. Said from, by somebody who's never run more than 5 miles and admires people who run anything. Marathon is just amazing. Half, what was it? 32 started, 17 finished the race. So there would be a lot of people dropping out of these things, conditions that they had. He does have a photo that's in the paper, a sketch and of his older daughter, Louise. And a few weeks later, he wins another. In a space of about 6 weeks, he won something like 4 or 5 races, 2 marathons, and some shorter races. They identified him as the Chicago runner, although he's from St. Louis, but he had spent enough time in Chicago and was in the Illinois Athletic Club at different times, so he was identified. He set a record time in that event. And there he is, again, the sketches. In June, he's in Chicago, and this is a photo showing the entrance. The entrance are 18 in number. They started at Grant Park, at the stadium, and they ran a few laps, and then they went out on the road, and they were coming back, and they would run some more laps within the stadium and finish. Well, it was so hot, people were dropping off. Then they got back to the stadium. The officials said, well, you got like another few miles to go, but let's just call it now. And Bill said, he was in the lead. He was going to win this thing, and it wasn't going to like have an asterisk next to it. And so he wanted to keep running. So he kept running a few more laps, and does, in the process, I think that when he lost maybe 12 pounds, they lost a lot of weight running in these things. And so here he is coming across, again, they have these, this from the start and then with the finish. 3:05:20. So he's having a great year in 1913, and he's looking forward to getting back to Boston. However, 1914, he gets typhoid fever. Typhoid fever. He was living in Chicago at this point. Over 250 people died of typhoid fever in Chicago then, and he was laid up for something like 12, 13 weeks in the hospital. It was actually from 13 going into 14. So he wasn't going to get to Boston in 1914. And his club there thought, well, he's pretty much washed up because Bill came out of the hospital, $500 in debt and with the medical treatment. The bricklayers and runners had fundraisers for him to pay off his bills. Somebody got him a job at a department store, the Boston store, omen of the future. He worked out at the Hebrew Institute, and he wrote about the graciousness of the people in the Hebrew Institute, helping his therapy, giving him a place to run, to shower, to clean up. And so he was gradually building himself back up for competitive running. He was featured among some other members of the bricklaying guild in this article in the January of 1915 in the Chicago Tribune. So he thought he was getting pretty fit and ready to go, but the sponsoring club, the Illinois Athletic Club, thought, they looked at him, and there he is, he's gone gray, really very gray from his typhoid experience. So he looked old, and it seems to run in the Kennedy family. But gray or white, I guess. But at any rate, Bill was determined to get back to Boston, and he was unable to aid the club to provide the funds for him. So let me just read a little excerpt from his own account of how he got to Boston. Back in 1915, being out of work in Chicago and having been running on the roads all winter with the idea of again trying the Boston race, being out of funds, I decided to beat my way by freight, hitchhiking not then in vogue. With 30 cents in my pocket, I climbed aboard a cattle car out of South Chicago one night. Cattle car in Chicago. It was a cold night, so I climbed up and slid into the feed box, closing the lid down on myself. It was warm enough in there as the cattle engender heat, but you can't sleep very well with them eating your bed from under you. I held that train down for 2 nights and a day, pulling into Buffalo the second morning. The only food I had in at that time was at Toledo, where we stopped to take water. Raising the lid of my berth, I saw the picture of a 16-ounce schooner of beer, and under it, 5 cents. I was out of that box in a jiffy, across the tracks, and downed 2 of those beers, grabbed 2 handfuls of pretzels, and back into my Pullman. It gave me the highball. I lay over for a day and slept in a 10-cent flop house at Buffalo, making Albany the afternoon of the 4th day. Before Prohibition, it was the custom with most breweries that an out-of-town visitor could sample their product. So, paying my respects, I was the recipient of 4 schooners of beer, my vitamins for the day. Leaving Albany, I arrived by freight in Springfield, Mass. at 2 a.m. I met up with a policeman who, on questioning me, took me over to a livery stable where the night man put me in a loft to sleep. On being roused at 6 a.m., I learned that I was not the only guest that night. I was allowed to depart with a handshake, while my fellow guests, who were members of the local fraternity, hobos, were forced to manicure the horses and stalls. Now within sight of my goal and knowing the Boston section of the 20th century was due shortly, I decked it into Boston, getting on the top of the car, arriving in the 5th day after 4 days and nights on the road. So that's how we arrived in Boston in 1915. So I did provide a little handout there. If you were to look at that, it's a Chicago man on one side showing Chicago man arriving. He had a flair for for publicity. He went down to the Globe, the Boston Globe, and talked to Larry Sweeney, who was one of the writers, and told the story. And very quickly, the story is published in the paper. They had a cartoonist put this all together, showing Bill the cattle car and all of that. He was a fellow who told newspapermen about his experiences, and they were very, very interested in, for decades, he was a source for these folks. That's the cartoon you have there. So he gets to Boston, and he's really a celebrity, and he's a celebrity there for really the next 25 years until World War II. He's only going to win that one time, but very, very, very well known. Now, in 1916, he's back in the East. He moved back to the New York area, and he's running in Yonkers. There was a Yonkers Marathon in these years before the First World War. There's an incident where he was running in Yonkers, and he showed a very practical concern for placing. And back in those days, I mean, he was an amateur, right? They're amateurs. They're not making money. He did, however, point out in his chapter on prizes that they would collect certain rewards for winning. And basically, what he tells is that let me find a place. Okay, he reached the track, was coming back at the end of the run, and he realizes he's in 5th position. And as he says, his face was numb and blue from the cold. As he remembered it later, a friend in the crowd yelled out and told me to slow down. So he's got a friend who says, the 5th place prize was a camera, and 6th place prize was a set of silverware. Bill thought about this. So there he's finishing up 26 miles. I didn't want the camera. You'd have to buy film for it. And Jesse would be pleased with the silverware. So then, as the newspaper reports, Kennedy jogged along until a half a mile from the end, from the tape, when he suddenly stopped and threw himself to the ground. To all urging and pleading, he refused to go on and waited for Joseph Carr, who was a half mile behind, to overtake him. It was a long, cold wait out there in the backstretch, and to pass away the time, Kennedy finally got up and began to run backwards. This even was too fast, and he slowed down to a walk, with a stop every minute or less to mark Carr's slow advance. It's in the newspaper. It must be true. Carr was coming on all too slowly, so Kennedy halted again until the Yonkers boy could come up. Carr seemed none too eager to overtake Kennedy, but he was too cold to follow the Chicago man's tactics, and a quarter mile from the finish line passed him. Kennedy fell into a dog trot, and and plodded along 5 feet behind the car while he's still dragging us out, stopping every few minutes to fix a troublesome shoelace. It's in the paper. In 40 yards, that lace came untied 8 times. And Kennedy lost 2 yards every time he stopped. The handful of spectators was in an uproar over the strange performance. So the newspapers said the officials are going to be on Kennedy about this one. This is not what you're supposed to do. But Bill pointed out later, the officials got on me for it, and there was an investigation, but they never got anything on me. And we looked, and we couldn't find any results of anything. So anyway, what happens is he's living back in the East. Excuse me. And he's got his eye on Boston. He runs in Boston in 1916, and he wants to run Boston. I guess I have to tell one story about 1916. I was trying to pass along, but I did get rid of my remote here. Great. So in 1916, he was running, and back in those days they had attendants. So from the beginning, they would have bicyclists that would be your attendant. So you're running, and a guy on a bicycle, a young fellow or an old fellow, didn't matter, would ride along with you and provide you with information, with a towel, with something to drink. So John Daly, a bricklayer who worked with me on a job in the Back Bay, borrowed a bike to ride with me. But he hadn't ridden for some years, and he had a hard time keeping up with me on the hills. It was a cold, raw day, so I had given him a pint of brandy diluted with hot water and sugar to feed to me as I called for it. Well, I called for it many times over the last 10 miles, but got no response from my brother bricklayer. He just kept pedaling along with eyes front. And Bill came in 6th in that year, but it was his first time in the top 8, so he was pretty happy with that. And he took a bath and got a rub down in the clubhouse and asked Daly, what's going on here? So in the dressing room, I questioned him as to why he didn't let me have a drink when I asked for it. He sheepishly replied, well, Bill, I was pretty well fagged out going up those hills, and you seemed all right, so I figured it might do you some harm, and as I wasn't feeling any too well myself, I drank it. You can well imagine the laugh from the sports writers gathered around. So that's 1917. So Bill wants to come back in 1916. He wants to come back in 1917, and he really was pretty anxious to finally win Boston. So April 1917, you'll remember reading about, because nobody that old, right? I always ask my students, and they think I'm around. I have to make clear to them, I was not around in World War I. And sometimes they believe me. But anyway, in 1917, as we know, there's the war in Europe. And Woodrow Wilson goes to Congress and gets the declaration of war passed. And it's within a few weeks that Bill is going to be getting to Boston. Now, the legend was he arrived having hitched a ride on the train, coming to Boston the night before, sleeping on a pool table, and then getting up and winning the race. Not really what happened. 1917, he was working in Rhode Island. He took a train up the week before. He bricklaying in Rhode Island with his brother Joe. He comes to Boston. He gets off the train, is going to go settle up for the night for someplace and look for a job for the week. Gets off and finds out there's a race that day, the Cathedral race, and it was a short race in Boston. It's a 10-mile run, and he missed the date to submit application, but because he was well known, they let him in. So he joins the race, he runs and he wins the race. It was a handicap race. So it's one of these odd things that Jimmy Hennigan, the fellow on the left, actually set a course record for this, but didn't win because of the handicap, so Bill will win. So there were 3 winners, and Bill McCartney's over there and came in second. But at any rate, Bill, sets the pace, and some of the other runners didn't want to run in Boston that race the week before. Thought it wouldn't be good for their training and so on. So Bill does go, and then what he does is sets up at a place to stay for the night, and here's a story about Chuck Miller, one of his buddies from Chicago, who had just come in and had been sleeping on a pool table, and so Bill says to him, I've got a room, and I think he was spending 25 cents a night for it. So he said, you can share the bed, so they slept, he shared the bed with Chuck. So that the point is that Chuck Miller is the guy who came in from Chicago that year, was injured, actually as Bill had been injured on his trip in 1915. Bill slept in this, it was YMCA, and Chuck joined him. But Chuck had been hurt coming in on the rails. Chuck slept on a pool table, and then when Bill wins, somehow the story got all sort of mixed up, and it was a very similar story to what Bill had in 1915. So the legend was born, and you would read these newspaper accounts for years in the 20s and 30s. Bill's still around, and they would repeat these stories about Bill being the guy who slept on the pool table and all that. So, facts, who cares? As it turns out, in 1917, Bill made a real big point of saying he's going to win this thing, and he made the point that Americans had to win. The problem was that the best runners in the world were the Finns, and he wrote, and it was in a paper, he spoke to a newspaperman, he said, we must repel the Finns. The Finns. Now there was no Finland, right? It was part of Russia. They weren't enemies, they weren't aliens that were offensive or anything, but he wanted to demonstrate that Americans were the greatest. We joined the war, and very much part of the patriotic spirit of the times. So in 1917, he does run. He goes out, very unusual, and goes into the lead very soon. And what he does is describe, and I'll just read a 4 or 5 lines where he says, there's always a time in a distance race when you run yourself out and your mind begins to say, you're a darn fool for going on. This is when the test comes. You need to get hold on your mental strings, shut out those thoughts, and forget that your better sense is telling you to do what hundreds of others have done and have not been disgraced for it. So he's writing this decades later, trying to tell other people what to do when they're running themselves. So he is successful. He comes in first. Clarence DeMar, who had won in 1911 and is going to go on and win 6 more times in Boston, came in second. Sidney Hatch, who was the great American threat from Chicago, came in third. So Bill is quite happily interviewed. He's run with a kerchief or a bandana on his head with an American flag sewn on it. He says this shows the superiority of the Americans. The first 3 winners were Americans. And they said, what are you going to do now, Bill? And he said, I'm going to go and enlist. He's 33 years old. Nobody had ever won the marathon that old. He was considered, beyond his prime. He wins this. He determines to go into the military. They didn't want him. It took a while for him to finally get accepted. He does get accepted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and he was working as a bricklayer. And what they really were doing was building roads when he got to Europe in 1918 to try to get the troops to the front, instead of having to go through the muddy roads, to have some roads that would be facilitating the speed of people getting out there. I forgot to mention, the day after he won the race, he gets back into his gear as a bricklayer, and this is part of the legend. He was not the only one. Every guy that was winning this race was a working man, basically, with a couple of exceptions, a few exceptions. And Clarence DeMar, who I said won 7 times, was a printer. Sometimes he ran the race and then went to work that afternoon, and he's typesetting the story about his own victory. And sometimes they had with him, and he putting the whole thing together, and works through the night, and then ran home the next morning. These marathoners are amazing people. Just a few other images from 1917, and here he is in 1918 on the right. He's joined the military. He finally got accepted. It was late in 1918, and he tried to get in Missouri, tried to get in here, there, and the other place. Finally got in. He goes to Maryland and was first thing they had to do was build the camp. Then they had to have housing and so on. But they go overseas, as I said. And trying to move along here with, of course, the war ends. We won, right? Everybody knows that. 1918, the war is over. And Bill and many of the folks were there for another year. So it took a long time to get the Americans over there. It took a long time to get them back. So what they were doing was getting involved in all sorts of games, and they had a great concern with keeping these fellows occupied and keeping them busy and trying to keep them healthy. So they had people from the YMCA and various organizations, physical education and programs for them. So that somebody came up with the idea of this run from Château Thierry to Paris, 60 miles, and it would be a relay race. And each would run, I think it was 2.5 or 3 miles each pair, or each segment of it. So at the finish line, all right, there are multiple teams. We have this photograph of Bill coming in. The photographer somehow missed the first runner. So worldwide flashes, this picture, Bill coming through, and then he's being interviewed, and then later, you know, they find out, oh, well, somebody else won it. But anyway, he had a knack for publicity. But he came in second. His group came in. He was expecting to and hoping to run in a marathon there that had been organized, but the night before had a knee injury and unexplained how it happened exactly, but he was unable to run. So he was very disappointed by that. So he comes back to the United States, and I'll just try to wrap up a couple of points here about the 1920s and 30s, and then maybe have some questions or comments. So he does get back, he runs in Boston, and he'll run in Boston many, many times. 1922, again with his knack for publicity, he runs the race, and there he is with his daughter Juanita, who, what did he do the day after the race? He took the Freedom Trail, walking around Boston, showing her. Now, there wasn't an official Freedom Trail, but he took her around the various historic sites and explained all these things to her about Boston. He loved the city. He goes back to Port Chester in Westchester County. It's right on the line with Connecticut. And here's not a very good picture, but I had to put this in. This is Bill, these are Bill's two daughters, it's Louise and Juanita, and this is my Aunt Joan, who was my godmother. She was born in 1920, and she just passed away in January, and it was really sad. Lost her, and her mind was really, really good. In the last few years, it was just really good. But she would talk about Bill, and she was our connection to him, and she described when she was a little girl how Jessie would like to dress her up, and you know, all this sort of stuff. And then after she died, my cousin sent this picture, and I was like, wow, this is what Joan's been talking about for all this time. And but anyway, but Bill was back in the 20s and 30s in Port Chester, New York. He and Whitey Michelson, who was from Stanford, running in Yankee Stadium, the new, well, it's the old, it's gone now, right? But what was the new Yankee Stadium? They would run marathons indoors. They would run marathons in the stadium. And he wrote about this is really deadly boring to run these things inside, but they did, and they did pretty well. Again, they would be working men. Whitey was a plumber. Bill was out laying bricks and so on. People would ask him, well, what are you doing? You know, you know, he said, laying bricks, that's hard work. You know, laying 2,000 bricks a day, very hard work. This is fun. You know, when I'm working as a bricklayer, I've got the boss looking over my shoulder and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I enjoy the running. And so he would take vacation days to go to Boston, and you know, he'd work his way there sometimes, but he loved it. There's Clarence DeMar that I've mentioned, winning so many times, set the record. Nobody's ever done that. Bill Rogers, who very graciously did the introduction or foreword for us in this book, won it 4 times. Bill Rogers won in New York 4 times. So one of the great runners really of all time. But Clarence DeMar, there he is. The great thing for Bill, in 1927, he's now 43 years old, and he came in third. So that was his next great event, and he was really thrilled about that, but not that thrilled. He wanted to win this thing. Here he is with Johnny Miles. This is kind of a famous picture shown in a lot of the books. Johnny had won it a couple times. Johnny is a youngster from Canada, and you know, there he is there in that but Johnny wasn't doing well. Johnny had some problems with his shoes, with the weather and so on, and he dropped out one year. But this year, 1930, he's coming across the finish line. He looks, and there's Bill, and so he just kind of slowed down a little bit, and they held hands and crossed the finish line. The judges didn't like that one too much either, and so they said Johnny was 10 and Bill was 11. They didn't tie. Bill also, during the 1920s, helped in the little village, the town of Portchester, to organize a marathon, and this is something that we found so much material on this and so many stories about this that I'm going to be working on another book about Portchester, which is where I lived in my first year, and my parents were from, and the family. So has a lot of interest, but it's more of a booster, local community history as well as marathoning. But anyway, Clarence DeMar ran there. You can find this on YouTube. If I was really technically proficient, I would have had this all worked out. But if you look up YouTube, 1930 Portchester Marathon, you'll get this, and you'll see they began in New York City and they ran out to Portchester. The great thing about that film, it's only like a minute and a half or something, but Bill doesn't win. Clarence DeMar wins. But at the end of the clip, you'll see Bill all smiley and just there he is smiling. So they zero it in on him anyway. You're not going to remember that, but I'm sure if you find you can see the connection. That's Portchester High School. Some years they ended up there. My grandfather worked on this building. His father was the contractor for it, built in the early 20s. Final couple of things about Bill. He went to Berlin in the very infamous 1936 Olympics. He was not an Olympic runner. He was not a competitor, but he had been very close to be invited in 1928, and that was his great disappointment that he didn't get back to go into the Olympics in 1928. So he was invited by the team to join them. So he was on the SS Manhattan as they went to Germany. He saw Adolf Hitler several times. This is the great time with Jesse Owens defying Hitler's racial expectations and so many others, and winning gold medals. Bill wrote in his account about the Olympics, and he described when they were over, he walked from Berlin to Hamburg, which I think is 120, 130 miles, is that right? And in the book, you would see, if you were to read it, how much he enjoyed the walk. And he walked like 20 miles, and he walked 40 miles, slept in a haystack, spent time at the youth hostel. Loved the German people, made a real point about how welcoming they were. They took him in and embraced him. So it was a positive experience. He didn't reflect much on the horrific developments in subsequent years. But in those years, 1937, 38, 39, he's winding down, he's feeling kind of old. He did run Boston and said, that's it, I'm giving up. And he ran one final race, and he did so poorly, I think came in 85th or something, never done that poorly. I gotta come back. And so he did come back, and he ran a few more times. Tarzan Brown, who was a Native American from Rhode Island, won in Portchester, he won in Boston, but Bill ran then. And in 1941, Les Pawson was another working man, won, but Bill ran that race. And thereafter, he ran one more race in 1944, not in Boston, but it was in New Orleans. He spent the war years with his brother Joe on the road building army bases and naval bases, so working for the government, constructing housing and so on. This is a photo, we're not quite sure exactly when, it was from the Boston Herald, but on the right showing Bill. This is one of the few trophies he had left. Family members, Jesse, his wife's family, have the trophy. And it's a little bit dinged up, and the story that, as they described it, was that, and the truth was, back in the 30s, Bill sold off some of the trophies, and like what were the prizes to him? He didn't really need those things. He needed the job, and he was in pretty tough shape, as so many other people were. So that was one of the few that survived, and there was apparently some sort of tiff going way back to when Bill had married Jesse and Nellie. Nellie's the one who actually had this trophy, the Nellie, his first love, and poor Nellie was widowed at an early age, and but she kept some of Bill's trophies until the end. And so it's somewhere in their family, but it got dinged up. Apparently Jesse threw it down the stairs one time. I don't know whether at Bill or somebody else in the family. Prizes didn't mean a whole lot to her. In 1943, there was a report that Bill was still 60 years old, which is, I think many of us would agree is not all that old. Still running, and now I saw the oldest marathoner the other day, or a few weeks ago in Boston, was I think an 85-year-old woman, right? But anyway, back in those days, this was pretty old. He didn't actually run Boston that year, but he was running in 1944 in New Orleans. He slowed down, still walking 4 miles a day in St. Louis, and there was a little article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about him at that point. I just want to conclude with, in 2018 here, just 2 weeks and a day ago, where that the winner on the men's side was a fellow from Japan who was known as he has a full-time job, 40 hours a week, and he's known as the citizen runner, so he's an amateur, right? He's not a professional, he's not the elite. The second place winner for the women was this young woman from, I think she was originally maybe Utah, but living in Arizona, and she's a nurse, full-time job. This is her second marathon, and you probably all know about this, right? She won second place in Boston. She got on a plane to go back to work on Tuesday, and she worked on Wednesday morning, and that's the spirit, I think, of the working people that, as we would now, we're writing about the Boston Marathon, the people who are not the elite, the professional runners, but it's the people who, like Sarah Sellers and I think Vincent's run these 4 times, and you just so much to be admired, and anybody who runs. Are all about that great camaraderie, and everybody that I've talked to that's a runner, and I think we have Dr. Brown back here, who's a runner, has done half marathons, right? Okay, and amazing. So, but I think the spirit just continues, and why did we write the book? Well, we were curious. That's why we do things, and we found an inspirational story, and as we got into it more and more, inspired by Bill and so many other people that continue to run. And am I inspired to go out and run myself? We'll get back to you on that one. So do we have any questions that anybody might have, or comments, or additions, or corrections? Yes. They came in the top 10. I forget the order, but there were like 3 of them, 2 brothers, and I don't know, the other third one was a cousin, but they didn't do so well there, but thank you for asking. Yeah, they were perennial winners. They won before, they're going to win after, and in the 20s they would win. I have a tough time following their names, quite honestly, but, and the newspapers did too. But yeah, they kept winning for a good number of years. They were Swedes. I should mention the Canadians. There were a lot of Canadians. There was a big contingent who would always show up from Canada. And one of the things that Bill did was in the 20s, after one of the Portchester races, he and the guys, they had a banquet and they would have talks and so on. They formed an International Marathon Runners Association to represent their interests vis-a-vis the Olympic committee, and they felt that they were being not considered seriously, and it was international because they had Canadians in that. But many of them some of the Finns stayed here in this country, became American citizens. Paul de Bruin won Boston. 1932, he was a German who became an American. Yeah, the Finns continued through the 20s anyway to be greatly feared, and I think into the 30s. It was Ville and Willie Kaironen and others. Sean.
Hi, Larry. I was just curious. Things are different now, but was there ever, especially after you went to the 1917 marathon, any like joint appearances or advertisements between him and other Boston sports stars? Like, Babe Ruth. Before he gets traded in 1919.
Yeah. In 1919. So the short answer would be no. I don't think of any. Babe Ruth and so on. They were the 20s. Jack Dempsey and all these guys. They were perennial stars. These guys would be stars 1 day or 2 days in a year. But they did, after the races, in the 20s in particular, the 30s it got pretty rough, and the Boston Athletic Association nearly went bankrupt, the sponsor. They sold their clubhouse, in fact. But in the 20s, it was kind of the glory days. And what they would do would be the night of after the race, they would go to the theaters, the movie theaters, the movie palaces, and they would be introduced. And so, Clarence DeMar would be up there and he'd give a little bit of a talk, and hundreds or thousands of people would be there. So they got a lot of attention then. Bill and Clarence and others would go. If they were in the top 3 or 4, they would get attention that night. Clarence DeMar was the Sunday school teacher, the Boy Scout leader. Bill was the opposite. But they worked together in this International Marathon Runners Association. Bill was the president for a number of years, the founding president, and Clarence was the secretary. But it was pretty short-lived. Now, the Clarence, he's the big star, right? But if you look in the book, you'll see there were some accounts where we discovered he was running. This I don't want to say the man was. I don't want to use the term crazy, but he would run from Keene, New Hampshire to work in Boston. Moved up to New Hampshire, and he was stopped in the middle of the night, running, but the police would, what's going on? He was running through Wellesley and the police stopped him. So you've got a star, Clarence DeMar, was virtually unrecognizable. The police would stop him. Now, of course, in the night, they're not going to know, but just trying to get, their stardom was pretty much limited to that time. The papers would have, articles maybe March, April, about the marathon, maybe 6 weeks, 7 weeks before. We'd look through like January, February, very seldom would find anything. So they were stars for a day or maybe for a week. Anybody else? Yes?
What kind of running gear did they use? What kind of shoes?
I'm
just asking about the running gear, the shoes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the shoes, that's they had leather shoes in these early years, and they would just, Bill would travel, and some of the others, they would go around, like Bill would travel on a train, he'd wrap up his running gear, the shoes, a shirt, and the shorts in a newspaper. And he'd arrive, he'd have it just wrapped up in a newspaper. The shoes, and this was designated for the running, but they were just leather shoes, not terribly comfortable. It was in the 20s they started developing some of the kind of like sneakers, and this is where actually, I mentioned it's Johnny Miles. And Johnny Miles, the young fellow, his father saw that he had these rubber soles, and was like, what's this about, And he's training up in Nova Scotia. And he would run through the snow and all that kind of stuff. He thinking, you get down to Boston, you look at the father trying to be helpful, looked at the shoes and said, there's too much there, and he scraped off rubber. Poor Johnny, as he's running, is running in much thinner shoes, the soles, and it was a very, very hot day. They're running, in Boston, they would be running on dirt road, gravel. We'd read these newspaper accounts of, whoa, they're putting concrete in Wellesley, and they're laying down the pavement. Some of the pavement was the tar. It was poor Johnny. It was in I don't know if it was 94, 93, some of it was into the 90s, and his shoes just gave way. And he was crucified by the press because he got out of the race and got into a car and drove to the finish line. And people said, here's this young whippersnapper, and he's just gone soft and all. But it was really very sad. So the shoes were just very, very primitive. They started developing specialized shoes, and somebody would make shoes for these guys. Clarence DeMar and some of the others would be actually, as amateurs, they're not supposed to endorse things, but they did actually endorse some the shoes. It was in the newspapers. But all that's evolving really in the 20s and 30s. But those early pictures, you find some of the Indian runners and maybe some others ran barefoot but Clarence DeMar, some of the stories that he would be running to avoid the tar in the roads, he'd run up on the sidewalk and behind the crowd. And again, the crowds were, they would always say there were maybe 250,000, maybe 500,000 people that were watching, but we don't know precisely for sure. But Clarence DeMar was a guy who would run on the side. Thinking Clarence, by the way, was a couple of times was stopped. And Clarence was the great runner. Clarence was the one who won 7 times, but the press really seemed to like Bill a whole lot better because Bill talked to them and so on. Clarence was noted for being thin-skinned or whatever, and actually some people would come out in the race and like throw some water, and Clarence punched a few spectators out. That didn't go too well in the papers. Sorry, you got thinking about the shoes. Anybody else or anything else? Well, thank you for coming out, and